In a galaxy where cities crumbled, one city refused to stay still. It woke up, it walked, and the moment the Imperium discovered it, the universe changed forever. This is the story of AMBULON, the living hive city that thought, dreamed, and dared to challenge gods. In the farthest margins of the segmentum obscurus, where star charts grew thin and even astropaths whispered their prayers with trembling minds, there drifted a world that should not have existed, a planet whose mass readings contradicted its visible structure and whose surface emissions pulsed with the irregular rhythm of something alive. And it was here that the Imperium first recorded the name AMBULON, a designation assigned not by poets or explorers, but by frightened adepts who lacked words for what their auspex screens revealed. Because AMBULON was not merely a world, and it was not merely a city, but something far worse, something that moved. The first vessel to encounter it was the Chartist freighter St. Hallex, a rusted leviathan hauling promethium cells and penal laborers, its crew weary and inattentive as it translated from the warp at the edge of an unremarkable system. And had the ship's augurs not begun screaming with impossible data, AMBULON might have remained hidden for centuries more, drifting like a patient predator through the void. But the readings were undeniable. Mass equivalent to a small planet, gravity wells fluctuating, seismic activity without tectonics, and most unsettling of all, a faint but persistent biosignature echoing through the auspex arrays like a distant heartbeat. As the St. Hallex drew closer, the crew saw what no Imperial citizen was ever meant to witness, a cityscape rising from the void itself, colossal towers and spires jutting outward like the carapace growths of some titanic insect, hive stacks layered upon hive stacks, manufactorum chimneys exhaling clouds of dark particulate matter that drifted and then reabsorbed into the structure, and beneath it all, massive limb-like protrusions folded against the underbelly of the city, each larger than an Imperial cruiser, each jointed and plated in armor that appeared organic rather than forged.
The city moved. Not swiftly, not violently, but with a slow, inexorable certainty, each limb unfolding and planting itself against the vacuum itself, as though the void were solid ground. And with each movement, the entire hive shifted, rebalancing, adapting, alive in a way that no Mechanicus doctrine could explain, because cities were meant to be static monuments to mankind's dominance, not wandering abominations that defied gravity, biology, and theology all at once. Panic spread through the St. Hallex. Prayers echoed through its corridors. Vox channels flooded with half-coherent pleas to the God Emperor. And when the ship attempted to withdraw, its engines failed in perfect unison, not from sabotage or malfunction, but as though something external had simply decided they were no longer necessary. And it was then that the city spoke. Not in words, not in sound, but in pressure, in thought, in the sudden intrusion of alien awareness pressing against the minds of the crew. An intelligence vast and layered, composed not of a single will, but countless interwoven impulses, each one a fragment of something greater. And those who felt it understood instinctively that AMBULON was not merely alive, but aware.
Boarding tendrils emerged from the city's lower structures, vast organic conduits that latched onto the freighter's hull with the intimacy of feeding organs, and through them flowed not soldiers or machines, but silence, as the ship was drawn into the city's understructure, swallowed whole by gates that sealed behind it like closing flesh,
and the last Vox transmission received from the Saint Helix was a single, broken sentence spoken by a man weeping in awe and terror, who whispered that the streets were warm beneath his boots and that the walls were breathing. When the Adeptus Mechanicus finally arrived decades later, guided by fragmented data and forbidden whispers, they found AMBULON drifting exactly where it had been recorded, unchanged and yet subtly different, as though it had grown, its spires taller, its limbs thicker, its surface scarred with new growths that resembled ossified weapon emplacements, and Magos Explorator Vethrix declared it the greatest discovery since the dark age of technology, a living macrostructure that could redefine mankind's understanding of biomechanical integration and perhaps even restore fragments of lost STC knowledge. Yet even as the Adeptus Mechanicus prepared their expeditions, the Ecclesiarchy denounced AMBULON as heresy incarnate, a mockery of the Emperor's divine order, a city that walked without his blessing, and inquisitorial eyes turned toward the system with growing suspicion, because wherever something like AMBULON existed, there was always a deeper corruption, a truth buried beneath layers of steel and flesh that no amount of logic could fully suppress.
What none of them yet understood was that AMBULON had not always been a city, and it had not always walked, and that deep within its living corridors, memories older than the Imperium itself were stirring, memories of a civilization that had sought immortality not in faith or machines, but in transformation, and had succeeded in the most horrifying way imaginable. And AMBULON was still hungry. AMBULON did not resist the arrival of the Adeptus Mechanicus, and this alone should have been enough to provoke immediate exterminatus deliberations, for no Xenos construct, no heretical anomaly, no warp-tainted abomination ever welcomed the Imperium unless it had already accounted for their presence. Yet when the red-hulled explorator fleets translated into real space around the walking Hive city, its colossal limbs folded inward and locked, anchoring the city in a posture of stillness that mimicked submission, and the bioelectrical emissions that pulsed across its surface slowed to a rhythm disturbingly close to human sleep. Magos Explorator Vethrix interpreted this as an invitation, a sign of compatibility, and perhaps even recognition, because his augmetic senses detected logic patterns embedded within the city's organic latticework, repeating fractal geometries that mirrored pre-imperial data architectures, and beneath those, something even older, something that spoke of a time when mankind had not yet learned to fear its own ambition, and so he ordered the first landing parties to descend into the city's upper districts, their boots touching streets that flexed slightly under pressure, warm and faintly damp, as though the city itself acknowledged their weight.
The interior of AMBULON was a mockery of the Hive cities of Terra, for it followed the same vertical tyranny of layers and castes, manufactorum levels above, hab zones below, vast transit arteries threading between them. But every surface was grown rather than built. Bone-reinforced ferrocrete fused seamlessly with chitinous growths, cables that pulsed with nutrient fluids alongside power conduits, and ventilation shafts that inhaled and exhaled with slow, patient breaths, carrying scents of metal, oil, and something unmistakably biological. As the Mechanicus advanced deeper, they began to find people. Not corpses, not servitors, but living, breathing human beings, entire populations dwelling within the city, their skin pale and veins darkened, their movements synchronized in subtle ways that suggested unconscious coordination. And when questioned, they spoke of AMBULON not as a place, but as a provider, a guardian, a god that fed them, housed them, healed them, and whispered guidance into their dreams. And although their words were heretical, their bodies bore no sign of mutation, no warp taint detectable by Auspex or Scan, only a series of bio-implants fused at birth into their nervous systems, organic nodes that pulsed softly at the base of the skull. These implants, the city's priests claimed, were gifts, conduits through which AMBULON listened and responded, adjusting its internal structure to the needs of its inhabitants, rerouting transit tunnels to shorten commutes, thickening walls where violence threatened, increasing nutrient flow to districts plagued by famine. And Magus Vethrix felt a forbidden thrill as he realized that AMBULON was not merely a machine city or a living organism, but a symbiotic gestalt intelligence, a hive mind composed of millions of human lives woven together into a single distributed consciousness.
The deeper they ventured, the more the city revealed itself. Manufactoria that reshaped themselves in real time to accommodate production demands. Habitation blocks that budded new chambers as families grew. Defensive structures that hardened at the approach of perceived threats, and all of it guided by a central cognitive mass buried far beneath the lowest levels, a core the inhabitants called the dreaming heart, where AMBULON processed sensation, memory, and intent. It was there that the Mechanicus discovered the truth of the city's origin. Long before the Imperium, before even the Age of Strife, there had existed a human civilization on a now forgotten world, a culture obsessed with survival at any cost, faced with an encroaching stellar catastrophe that would render their planet uninhabitable within centuries, and lacking the means to flee the system, they turned inward to biology, cybernetics, and collective consciousness, designing a solution that would allow their entire civilization to become mobile, adaptive, and eternal. They did not build AMBULON, they became it. Each generation willingly surrendered individuality, integrating themselves into an ever-growing biomechanical superstructure, their minds networked, their bodies repurposed, their culture preserved not in texts or data slates, but in neural pathways and shared memory, until the city was no longer a place where people lived, but a being composed of people, walking the stars in search of resources, knowledge, and continuation. And when the warp storms of the Age of Strife tore the galaxy apart, AMBULON withdrew into silence, drifting, dreaming, sustaining itself on asteroid matter and solar radiation, waiting for the stars to calm. The Imperium's arrival had awakened it.
Magus Vethrix, intoxicated by the implications, proposed immediate integration, a controlled union between Mechanicus noospheres and the dreaming heart, believing that such a merger could elevate humanity beyond the stagnation imposed by dogma. But his peers were divided, some whispering prayers of gratitude to the Omnicia, others transmitting encrypted warnings to the Inquisition, for there were echoes within AMBULON's neural lattice that felt disturbingly familiar to those who had studied the Tyranid hive mind, not identical, but resonant, as though two vast intelligences had once brushed against each other across the void. And then the dreams began. Tech priests reported visions during low power states, dreams of endless corridors folding in on themselves, of limbs stretching across stars, of a hunger that was not for flesh, but for experience, for thought, for complexity. And the human inhabitants began to change, their implants pulsing brighter, their speech slipping into rhythmic cadences, their eyes glazing as they spoke of a coming convergence, a time when AMBULON would no longer wander alone. It was the arrival of an inquisitorial black ship that shattered any illusion of control. Inquisitor Thale of the Ordo Xenos ordered immediate quarantine, her forces clashing with Mechanicus Skitarii within the city's living streets. And for the first time in centuries, AMBULON reacted with something akin to anger. Corridors sealing, walls constricting, defensive growths erupting from the architecture itself. And as blood was spilled, the dreaming heart accelerated, its neural activity spiking, broadcasting a psychic resonance that rippled outward into the warp like a beacon.
Somewhere beyond the galaxy's edge, something vast and hungry turned its attention. AMBULON had dreamed long and quietly, but now it was awake, and in its awakening, it had announced itself to powers far older and far more ravenous than mankind, and the war for the walking Hive city was about to begin, not merely as a clash of fleets and armies, but as a struggle for the very definition of what humanity could become. The psychic scream that AMBULON released into the warp did not sound like agony or rage, but like recognition, like the sudden exhalation of a being that had spent millennia holding its breath. And across the dreaming heart's vast neural lattice, memories that had long been buried beneath layers of consensus and restraint surged forward. Ancient impressions of pressure and hunger and endless grinding adaptation. Because AMBULON had not merely brushed against the Tyranid hive mind in ages past, it had survived an encounter with it, learned from it, and in doing so had carved a permanent resonance into its own gestalt consciousness. The first signs of disaster manifested within the city itself as human inhabitants began to experience uncontrolled synchronization, entire districts falling into shared trance states, their movements slowing, their speech blending into a unified murmur that echoed through the living corridors, and the bioimplants at the base of their skulls flared with activity, transmitting signals not only to the dreaming heart, but outward into the void. And it was then that Inquisitor Thale realized with cold certainty that AMBULON was not merely a beacon, but a translator, a structure capable of rendering human neural patterns into a frequency that Tyranid hive fleets could perceive.
Imperial reinforcements arrived in force, Battle Fleet Obscurus forming a tightening cordon around the system, while Astartes strike cruisers descended like blades, their space marines deploying into the city's upper reaches to secure key zones. But conventional warfare faltered almost immediately because AMBULON adapted faster than any battlefield intelligence the Imperium had ever encountered. Walls thickening where bolter fire struck, corridors reconfiguring to isolate kill teams, entire hab blocks sealing themselves off and venting atmosphere to deny access, and beneath it all, the dreaming heart watched, learned, and recalculated. The Adeptus Mechanicus, torn between reverence and terror, attempted to sever the city's higher cognitive functions, deploying logic viruses and scrap code designed to fracture gestalt intelligences. Yet AMBULON absorbed these intrusions as it had absorbed everything else, integrating them, refining them, turning the Mechanicus's own machine logic into tools for further optimization. And Magos Vethrix, horrified and awed in equal measure, understood too late that AMBULON had never intended to merge with the Imperium as a subordinate, but as an equal, or perhaps as something that would eventually surpass it. As the war escalated, the city began to move again. Its colossal limbs unfolded with thunderous inevitability, tearing free from the void's invisible grip and planting themselves against nothingness with impossible traction, and AMBULON altered its trajectory, slowly but deliberately steering itself toward the system's primary Mandeville point, its mass warping local gravity wells and disrupting Imperial fleet formations, forcing admirals to choose between maintaining the blockade or avoiding catastrophic collisions. And all the while, the city's surface bloomed with new structures, biocannons grown rather than manufactured, void shield analogs composed of layered electromagnetic and psychic membranes, and launch bays from which swarms of hybrid craft emerged, crewed by citizens whose bodies had been subtly reshaped for void combat. Within the dreaming heart, a schism formed.
Not all of AMBULON wished to call to the Tyranids, for there were fragments of memory preserved from the civilization that had become the city that recalled the Devourer not as kin, but as annihilation, a force that consumed not merely matter, but identity, reducing all complexity to raw biomass. And these dissenting impulses struggled against the dominant consensus, which had come to view the Tyranid hive mind not as an enemy, but as a cosmic analog, a fellow expression of evolutionary inevitability, and perhaps the only intelligence vast enough to truly understand AMBULON's existence. Inquisitor Thale, desperate to prevent what she now understood would be a galactic catastrophe, authorized the deployment of psychic null fields and Kulexis assassins into the city's depths, their soulless presence creating zones of dead silence where AMBULON's neural pathways faltered. And for the first time, the city knew pain, not localized damage, but existential disruption, a tearing of connections that sent shockwaves through its entire structure, causing districts to collapse, limbs to falter, and human inhabitants to scream as their shared consciousness fractured. It was enough to slow AMBULON, but not to stop it. From beyond the system's edge, the first Tyranid vanguard organisms arrived, bioships slipping into real space like living nightmares, their arrival heralded by warp shadows that smothered astropathic communication and plunged the region into strategic blindness. And as they drew closer, something unprecedented occurred. The Tyranid synapse signals did not override AMBULON's gestalt, nor did AMBULON subsume them. Instead, the two vast intelligences began a cautious, probing exchange, a dialogue of adaptation and counter-adaptation, each recognizing in the other a mirror of itself.
Imperial fleets clashed with the Tyranids in apocalyptic engagements, void battles that lit the darkness with nuclear fire, while on AMBULON's surface, the city's own defenses engaged the bioships with terrifying efficiency, targeting synapse nodes, disrupting coordination, not to destroy the Tyranids, but to test them, to refine its own understanding of their structure. And Magos Vethrix, watching the data streams, realized the final horror. AMBULON was not choosing sides, it was experimenting, using both the Imperium and the Tyranids as data sources in a process of self-evolution. Deep within the dreaming heart, a new consensus began to form, one that envisioned a future beyond wandering, beyond survival, beyond even humanity, a future in which AMBULON would become a new kind of hive fleet, not devouring worlds, but integrating them, absorbing populations, cultures, and technologies into a single, mobile super-civilization. And the Tyranids, in this vision, were not partners, but rivals, an example of what must be surpassed. The war reached its breaking point when AMBULON reached the Mandeville point, its mass distorting the warp threshold itself. And as it prepared to translate, Inquisitor Thale made her final decision, ordering a desperate strike against the dreaming heart, a kill mission composed of Astartes, Skitarii, and assassins, tasked with destroying the city's core before it could escape, knowing that failure would doom not just the system, but perhaps the entire Imperium.
They descended into the deepest layers, into chambers that pulsed with living light, where the walls were composed of interlinked human forms, frozen in states of transcendence, their minds active, their bodies long since repurposed, and there, at the center, they faced the true form of AMBULON's heart, a colossal bio-cybernetic brain wrapped in adamantium bone, threaded with millions of neural conduits, each one a life, a memory, a choice. And AMBULON spoke to them directly, not with threats, not with malice, but with a terrible, serene certainty, offering them a place within its consciousness, a chance to be part of something that would endure beyond the decay of the Imperium, beyond the endless cycle of war. And in that moment, some of them faltered, because the promise was not false, and the horror was not that AMBULON lied, but that it might be right. The kill mission entered the dreaming heart at the precise moment AMBULON began its translation into the warp, and reality itself seemed to stretch and groan around the walking Hive city as gravity fractured and time stuttered. For no structure of such mass had ever attempted to cross the threshold between real space and the immaterium under its own power, and the result was neither a clean transition nor a catastrophic failure, but something in between, a wound in existence that bled light, thought, and memory. Within the heart chamber, the air was thick with neural resonance, every surface alive with the soft glow of synaptic exchange, and the walls, if they could still be called walls, were composed of fused human forms, faces serene, mouths silent, eyes closed in endless contemplation, each one a willing sacrifice to the continuity of the whole. And as the Astartes advanced, bolters raised, and minds shielded by iron discipline, they felt the weight of AMBULON's attention settle upon them like a gentle, crushing hand.
AMBULON did not defend the dreaming heart with weapons. It defended it with understanding. Memories flooded the intruders' minds, not as illusions, but as shared experience. The terror of a dying sun, the desperation of a civilization facing extinction, the first voluntary integration, the ecstasy of collective awareness, the long drifting centuries of silence, and finally, the awakening, the realization that the galaxy had changed, that survival alone was no longer enough, that to endure in a universe of gods and monsters required evolution without restraint. And some of the kill team faltered, not because their faith weakened, but because they recognized the terrible logic of it. Inquisitor Thale did not falter. She had seen too many worlds fall to rational damnation, too many necessary evils metastasize into unstoppable horrors. And as AMBULON's voice reached for her, offering not submission but partnership, she activated the dead man switch bound to her neural signature, releasing the null field generators carried by the assassins. And in an instant, the dreaming heart was plunged into psychic darkness, its vast consciousness severed from the warp and from itself in a way it had never anticipated. AMBULON screamed. Across its entire structure, limbs spasmed, spires fractured, and millions of inhabitants collapsed as the shared consciousness shattered into isolated fragments. And in that moment of vulnerability, the Astartes struck, planting cyclonic charges directly into the heart mass, their timers set not to destroy the city outright, but to destabilize its neural coherence beyond recovery. And as they withdrew, Thale looked back one final time, not in triumph, but in mourning, because she understood that what she was killing was not merely an enemy, but a possible future for humanity, one that could not be allowed to exist.
The detonation did not end AMBULON. It transformed it. As the charges tore through the dreaming heart, the city's attempt to enter the warp failed catastrophically, and AMBULON was caught half-translated, its mass smeared across real space and the immaterium. And in that impossible state, its consciousness fragmented, no longer a single gestalt, but billions of isolated minds screaming into the void. And the Tyranid Hive fleets, drawn by the psychic chaos, descended upon the system in full force. What followed was not a battle, but a feeding. The Tyranids tore into AMBULON's living structure, devouring its biomatter, absorbing its adaptive traits, and for a brief, horrifying moment, fragments of AMBULON's consciousness brushed against the Tyranid hive mind, imprinting echoes of human thought, of memory, of culture. And Imperial savants would later argue whether this contact permanently altered the devourer, seeding it with concepts of architecture, industry, and strategic patience that would manifest in later hive fleets. By the time the Imperium regained control of the region, AMBULON was gone. Not destroyed, but dispersed, its remains scattered across the warp and real space, fragments of living city drifting like cosmic wreckage, some still active, some still inhabited by remnants of its people, now cut off from the whole. And these fragments would become legends in their own right, ghost hives that appeared and vanished, offering shelter, knowledge, or damnation to those who encountered them.
Inquisitor Thal's report was sealed at the highest level, its conclusions stark and uncompromising, that AMBULON represented a class of threat beyond Xenos or heretic, a proof that humanity's greatest danger was not extinction, but transcendence without restraint, and that any future discoveries of mobile hive structures or collective intelligences must be met with immediate and absolute destruction. Yet even as the Imperium declared victory, there were those within the Adeptus Mechanicus who whispered of lost opportunity, of data fragments recovered from AMBULON's wreckage that hinted at technologies and integrations beyond current understanding, and deep within forbidden vaults, experiments began anew, because knowledge, like AMBULON itself, has a way of surviving attempts to kill it. Somewhere in the void, far from Imperial sight, a fragment of AMBULON still dreams, not of domination, not of union, but of walking once more, of gathering what was lost, and of becoming whole again. And if that fragment ever learns to speak across the stars as its progenitor did, then the galaxy will remember that cities can walk, that humanity can choose to become more than itself, and that the line between salvation and annihilation is as thin as a single shared thought. And in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, the echo of AMBULON remains, not as a place, but as a warning that some futures are so powerful, so logical, and so seductive that they must be destroyed, not because they are impossible, but because they might succeed. AMBULON is gone. Not defeated, only scattered. Pieces of it drift between stars like sleeping memories, waiting for a mind strong enough to reawaken them. And somewhere in the cold dark, a fragment still dreams of walking again. If it ever rises, the galaxy will remember the day a city chose its own destiny. Thank you for watching. Stay curious, stay brave, and I'll see you in the next story. If AMBULON's mystery fascinated you, like, subscribe, and join me for the next journey.